Hello and most welcome to 387. Here I'm sitting cozily in some sun. I found a shaded place. I hope the cars won't disturb too much. I will speak as clear as I possibly can. I would today tell you a little known story about how Monsieur Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, got nominated to an important honorary position in Cambridge. The annual award from Cambridge. But once that was placed, the first time for almost 3 decades, 4 of the dons opposed to the reward or the pointing to Derrida for the annual award. And that's never happened in Cambridge long history. They all put their book down and said, non placet, I do not agree, I do not concord with this. So he was not awarded the award, and the reason being that it seemed that his philosophy was undefinable, even to his own accord. It did not fit into rigor. It didn't follow the principle of philosophical thinking or even academic thinking. 2 other dons who opposed themselves were outside philosophy, one from literature and one from history. Here is one of the dons that opposed himself. He said like this, an exact cite, quote from David Hillel Rubin. French academic philosophy runs by a system of mandarins and gurus and fashions. They would be generally perceived by British philosopher as not having the same standards, precision and clarity and rigor that as we would. This is from the more famous Henry Erskine Hill. Loads of people these days invoke something called theory, which I think proper philosopher would not admit to. What sort of writer is Derrida? Is he a failed theorist? If not a theorist, then what is he? And this might be the strongest one from Professor Peter Lennon. The French excel in fabricated terms of shifting meaning, which makes it impossible to detect at what point philosophical speculation turns to gibberish. Deconstruction is a theory which appears to lend itself most readily to babbling, obfuscation. That is pretty hard words, but I experienced something exactly the same manner when I studied philosophy in Sweden. Derrida was not clear, he was undefinable, it was something bad, you could not explain what he was doing. All those critiques are things that actually Derrida sees as his honor to preserve. And I think that is quite interesting. It defies definitions, it cannot be explained. It's more a movement, an energy of undoing strings that attach the text. Let us compare this to what Derrida was doing with the Pharmakon. What is he doing with a text of Socrates, or rather Plato, who's suspected to have written it? he undid the binary positions. He tried to find a set of gestures to make it undecidable. So it would seem that the ones that were objecting from Cambridge, professor in English literature, professor in philosophy, professor of Anglo-Saxon and literary history and English literature, exactly what they are trying to do, their very work is what Derrida is undoing. And I think that is most interesting. So there is no proper wonder why these professors put down their book and said nonplussed. It makes sense. It fits the circumstance. To come to an understanding with Plato, Derrida writes, in the way I've sketched out is already to slip away from the recognized model of commentary, whether they try to corroborate or refute, to confirm or to overturn, or to mark a return to Plato. Commentaries from the English side would say Derrida's text cannot be either important or even properly philosophical. And for Erskine we hear Derrida is turning aside a serious philosophical quest, deliberately perverting it. It's just a literary poetic play on terms of language. So Derrida is pertaining to mythology, or the dream side of reality, or the side of unreality and untruth. He is definitely defender of the other side. Sometimes I think of Derrida as might be the defender of the weak part, the one that is constantly marginalized. But that's only partly true. It's not always the case that the slave turns against his master. It does happen, but far from always. And his overturning is not permanent, it's part of the gesture. Undoing the text is done by taking to the front side or the foreground the suppressed side of the matter. But it doesn't mean that the suppressed side should henceforth be the dominating side. So it's not like the French Revolution, turning the whole class system upside down, or any sort of reform that have happened since the French Revolution, where we try to equalate, we try to quote in people of other races, creeds, gender, sexual inclinations, provincial or class heritage. It's not that what he's trying to do. What he's trying to do is, with this gesture, to undo the polarities that text has built. And those polarities, and this is rather important, those polarities always does short circuit themselves. Short circuit means that they are neutralizing themselves. That's the lesson from philosophical reflection. Think of it as putting plus and minus together, you get zero. Adding different stuff in chemistry can make something that was originally sour or alkaline completely neutral. That's how it's done. So Plato's text is already unraveling itself. The polarities play its own self. And what Derrida is doing is saving the text. He comes as a good Samaritan to save the text, to make it whole once more, and not dependent on polarities like extremes, true and false, false and true, black and white, right and wrong, negative, positive. And there you go. We always undo everything by criticizing someone or something or some tendency. I can see it all over the internet these days. There is a debate raging on different subjects, and they are all undoing themselves. And that means a waste of energy. That also means that no action will ever be done. Because we need a firmer, more solid foundation to stand on than to say that my position is just the opposition of someone else's or something else, whatever that might be. That way of defining oneself, that the text could lend itself to, could, it's an important word, makes it more shallow. That, I would say, is the actual tendency of the downfall of intellectuality in the West. It lends itself to this shallow polarization tendency. And you have this, instead of a solid text standing on massive ground, making itself understood with the author present, you have this play on presence and absence, and presence is being, in this case, completely dependent on absence. And you start to hear these ludicrous things like Derrida is in himself not here anymore because he's gone, he's absent. He's not here to cure the text or disseminate it or seminate it or whatever you like. That is not the whole truth. He is constantly here. The presency is doing its job, and I think that is some tendency that we neglect to see today. Listen to Aristotle, how this tendency can look. Writing is both useless and dangerous. That's the point of Pharmakon, more or less. And we need to get closer to something we could call phonocentrism, that the actual spoken sounds are much closer to the meaning than the written words. Sounds familiar? Spoken words are the symbols of mental experience, and written words are the symbols of spoken words, actually said by Aristotle himself. And we know how important Aristotle is for both Christianity, Judaism, and I would say even most for Islam. He is incredibly important, and that is one of the reasons the fixation of the spoken word is so clear, for instance in Islam, which should pronounced in exactly the same way that it has always been. That's even led to the survival of what might be the most widespread old language. I'm not sure, but I do suspect that classical Arabic is the most widespread archaic language, or very old language at least. It has at least 1,000 years on its shoulder, and it's still used today, both in writing, talking, and poetry and so forth. And you see the whole derivation on what is truer. Words, spoken words, are truer than writing. Writing is truer than something that is copied from writing, not the original writing, or as you mentioned, Kalle, primary source. The primary is the most important because it has the most presence, the original. And then you have the copies that are of much lesser value, and then you have the copy of the copy, and the value goes down and down. And that is how it goes in Western thinking. And it's a thinking that undermines itself directly, already, always. In the same instant it is thought, done, pronounced, written, made, whatever, it has already undermined itself. And that is the reason for the weakness of language today. It makes itself, whatever of these things it is, dependent on what it is not. And it's not hard to see how that tendency undoes itself all the time, permanently, and really without any pause. It is something that happens directly. The permanent undoing of thinking, talking, I think I mentioned some other time that even thinking is something that is put under suspicion. It's not pure enough. Of course, language often is perceived by today's gurus as not being pure enough, and something pure should be thinking, and thinking is not enough as well. There should be unthinking. Stop thinking, as Alan Watts used to say. Well, I'm not too sure about that. I think we need to look at what we have and what we are doing in this very moment. And it might be that the limitations are already set when we start the game. What we need to learn is how to play the game. And whereas I would say the different professors of the different strands from Cambridge who objected to the well-deserved award to Jacques Derrida, I think they felt rather ashamed 20 years later. They only stand for a very limited subject, even according to themselves, whereas deconstruction does not ever limit itself, not even to itself or its own texts. Deconstruction is both body and mind, inside and outside, all the subject. Doesn't matter if it's tennis, cooking, or nail polishing, journeys to Tasmania, you name it. It is not limited, and there it has its force. It's also something you can learn, whereas polarization and what the professor said was the core of English thinking. It's something incredibly time dependent. It is something that is caused by different negations and positivations, if you like, and it is absolutely only functionable in 1992, because I can tell you it's long gone. Nobody says like that anymore. And that means that the method, if there even is a method to analytical philosophy, I seriously doubt that, is long gone. No more productive, you can no longer use it, and you could never have used it without being inside the subject, and usually in a very narrow subject, and since it's obliterating itself, it's not effective. Those are things I feel to be much stronger. So you have on the one side the Cambridge professor's view that this so-called sensed feeling of what is rigor and clarity, which is completely time dependent because of the polary situation between now and present. That's logocentrism. It's also dependent on the social situation, who's in charge. That is the thing that is in the end just babbling, because it will not survive 5 years, and it hasn't done so far. It changes even more quickly than 5 years now. So there is no method. You can't use it effectively if you write something else or you want to make a speech. I want to use the thing I learned. These things that the Cambridge professor proposed, that's unusable to their own accord, because they are constantly referring to something that's absent. The transcendental reason, something that never can be taught, it can only be sort of conjured in the moment, or pointed to. I think that's a better word. It can be pointed to, but it's never ever present. It's not there. So these professors can easily be deconstructed, and exactly what they claim they're standing for can be shown what they are doing. And whereas Derrida had a method that can be learned, it will take years, admittedly, and you can get differently better, you get something you can use all your life, and you can also improve it. Whereas the Cambridge professor would perceive it preposterous that their idea of clarity, non-obscurity, rationality is something that can be improved, is preposterous. It's nonsense for them, because they are having their truth in the presence of the now, with the voice being here. And they don't give away knowledge, they are just admiring it from a distance, and it can never be reached. I am lucky enough to have heard this even at a speech or a public lecture some years ago. It was my beloved professors. Some of them have parted from this earthly life now, but during one of the science festival in my hometown, and they were open to questions, and somebody asked them, can we know what truth is? And the person explained that person wanted to know what truth is for his own life, but also for his doing. I think he was a student, so he needed to know truth, how to choose truth. And the professors answered, well, it might take several hundred years until we know what truth is. So we have to make do with rules, what truth should be used like. Couple of hundred years, and he answers similar questions about morality, meaning of life, and all sorts of stuff in the same way. cannot be known, or it will be known in the future once we made enough analysis. This is the core of academic thinking. This is what we have today. No wonder people, some of the audience, including me, I thought he was at first joking. Are he serious? Yes, he was. And everyone today are pointing to that sort of thinking as being the top of the cream, the best you can have. Although you can't use it, will you use it in a thesis, in an article, in your own book, or in your own thinking, you're bound to fail according to their own accord. So it's not something they don't admit to. They think it's a thing of honor to strive eternally for truth and never succeed. Who's having the who's doing a game of words now? Who's doing the babbling? Well, I really wonder if it ever were Derrida. But this is a thing that goes through all of society. It doesn't ever, and that's very important, ever limit itself to literary theory, the English language, the Swedish language, history only, because it defies limits in itself. And to learn deconstruction is, as Rodolphe Gachet, is to venture into many different subjects. That's is at its very core, so to speak, how to learn it. So in contrast to learning special skills like sharpening a knife or anything, you name it, cutting grass, this is a global skill because its globality is inscribed in its beginning. So for me, it's the best way of learning deconstruction. It's doing many different things from many different approaches and get it into your chest, because that would always be with you whatever you do and however you do that thing. It's something you learn and you can sort of refine it by time. It gets better, and it's bettering you as well. You progress, body and soul. Whereas this form of knowledge, this Cambridge professor claiming they were supporting tradition, I would say no. I would say they don't. Tradition, I think Cambridge was instituted in 1492. And the people of 1492 would have think it was ridiculous what they were doing, because it's their doing that is the nonsense. And in the end, they only have what they say at that instant that works. I think the universities from the beginning learned people knowledge. Knowledge being so despised today, casted out like the scapegoat and blamed for all sorts of things, being old-fashioned or being like this, word babbling, just the opposite, being governed by fashion or those things. No, it is just the contrary. This is going back to what these people really wanted, their action. I will take a concrete example here from the dynamics of time and space. Let us put this into position. Centuries ago, the idea of property was little developed, and trade was conducted informally on the context of other interactions based on little more than an agreement that certain goods had value. Starting with something as simple as a handful of salt, or why not a string of beads? Trade gradually expanded. Merchants develop their own concern and ways of life, evolve their own way of seeing the world and attempting to protect their interests. From these beginnings, the whole system of finance took form, and in time the science of economics, the law of corporations, and many other disciplines as well. Today, no branch of human knowledge is wholly unaffected by these forms of understanding. From similar humble beginnings, the great domains of knowing have likely taken form. Philosophy, psychology, religion, science, each making its own contributions to the welfare of human beings. Each embodying different manifestations of knowledge. In fact, all the structures we adopt and the views we expose, even the study of what we value as knowledge at different times and in different circumstances, is a source of knowledge. We could understand this circumstance as demonstrating only what is self-evident. Whatever we learn is knowledge. But there is more at stake than that. From the point of view of knowledge, we can put it this way. Knowledge is knowable. In particulars of what presents itself, knowledge makes itself available, not as object for a base bystander, not as something to be known by somebody, but as the intrinsic knowledgeability of the whole. The usual structures of language do not easily accommodate such availability. Independent of subject and object, but we can speak of knowingness and knowability. We can refer to knowledgeability. We can also put it in this way. Within every appearance, we are already in contact with the body of knowledge. It may be difficult to discover the boundless availability of knowledge, for our own efforts to accumulate knowledge can only proceed little by little, as demonstrated by the Cambridge professors, in a process that goes on endlessly. This is especially true today, when knowledge is structured so that it constantly proliferates. As the facts available to be known expand exponentially, the interconnections that could lead us back to the whole are buried or forgotten. Yet knowledge by nature invites knowledge, and knowledge accumulates accordingly in the natural progressions that signals the presence of the body of knowledge. Once we give up our insistence on owning knowledge, we can recognize that when we receive, achieve, seek, or inquire knowledge, this is knowledge. So we notice that results and achievements come without depending on our efforts. As we learn to see through our own limits, we discover that we have the capacity for inspiring vision and creative imagination in ourselves and others. Some who have seen this dynamic at work have called it love or truth. Others have spoken instead of wisdom or beauty or blessing. It does not matter. Labels do not confine knowledge, nor do words bring it to a halt. That is rather promising. But that shows once we start to understand what polarity does to text, to sort of thinking, to our own body system, to our whole world, and with all these divisions between subjects, different themes, different inclinations, directions, you name it, it can become whole. And that takes an investigation to how it started. One could say, as an example, to learn the correct use of a word, or the weight of a word, I would say, you need to look into how it was once used. You need etymology. And that's the same thing with all produced handicraft-made knowledge. We gain knowledge by doing. And the doing is sort of acquiring the knowledge or storing it, and that can be accessed. But if we etiquette that and say that knowledge comes in bit and I acquire them bit by bit, and we start to think that the weeks and days I've studied, that's the knowledge, or how many parts of the Encyclopedia Britannica I know, that's the knowledge. Then you defined it, then you stored it away, and then you made it inaccessible for the body of knowledge, for the whole knowledge as something embodied. Well, I think I better round up there. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.